Okay. Welcome back. We have a very talented and experienced speaker, Walter Cruttenden, co-founder of Acorn, 5 million customers. That's no small endeavor. And I understand you've written a book, and he's also done a documentary film narrated by James Earl Jones. So we've got a man of many talents, many directions. Please give a warm Inside Edge welcome to Walter Cruttenden.
What a great crowd. Seriously, it's like being in a home with friends here, you know. You're all so warm, and I appreciate you inviting me here. Not a home. Our home. So today I'm going to talk about history. This cycle of time that was known to ancient cultures around the world. Plato called it the Great Year. And it's kind of been lost in modern times, but I think that there's a great wisdom in understanding history very deeply. In fact, some have said that, you know, civilization today is a little bit troubled. And I read a study about Alzheimer and dementia patients that when people forget where they've been, they have a really difficult time planning where they're going. And it doesn't matter the reason for the forgetfulness, but when you can't remember where you're going, you have stress and problems. And so I think we're kind of like that as a species. You know, we've lost a great deal of our history, or we don't talk about it much. And so I've written this book, Lost Star: Myth and Time, to try to look at our long history, because I think it hints at who we are, and we can feel a little bit about ourselves, a little bit better about ourselves and the world. And so hope you enjoy this. And I'm also going to try to tie it to investing a little bit, just for fun, see if we can make it happen. If you'd like, I did bring a few extra copies of this book. They're free. They're in the back over there by the lamp, so make sure they're all gone by the time we leave here. And I'll open up with just a couple of minutes introduction from our film, The Great Year, narrated by James Earl Jones, as mentioned. And he'll set the stage for what we're going to talk about.
Lost civilizations, the Golden Age, Shangri-La. Might there be some truth to these ancient tales? Our ancestors spoke of a grand cycle bringing about high ages of enlightenment and low ages of darkness, marked by the movement of the heavens.
The notion of individuals in their own place of worship being connected to some larger, either terrestrial or cosmic space, is not uncommon.
Mayan astronomy looked at huge cycles of movements of stars. They actually had an exact date in their calendar for the beginning of the world.
The evidence for these advanced civilizations is almost universal in the sense that they seem to be at their height very near the beginning.
Just as day and night are caused by the spinning Earth, and the seasons are caused by the Earth's orbit around the sun, some ancient cultures believed there's an even larger cycle that influences the rise and fall of civilizations. History and astronomy may help us rediscover this forgotten cycle, a cycle said to be so vast it reaches beyond our solar system, yet affects our everyday lives. Plato called it the Great Year.
This song was written by Pete Seeger in the late 50s, made famous by the Byrds in the 60s, a year when I was searching for myself, a decade actually. But the words to that song, Turn, 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 come from, Ecclesiastes, right? And it's, over 3,000 years old. They're not quite sure. But you find that a lot of ancient cultures are talking about this cycle. And they saw it as very natural that you would have high times of enlightenment and dark times or dark ages, and almost like you have the seasons of the year. And I think today we'll try to show some of the evidence for that. But also, when you understand where you are in the cycle, you can actually succeed better in life. And so we're at a point in the cycle now where we're going from the lowest, darkest age, at a time when we just thought we were these physical bodies and had no knowledge of molecules or atoms or electricity or any of the finer forces, into we had the Renaissance, or the rebirth of the cycle. And it's a time of discovering all these finer forces, greater principles. And there's something called Moore's Law that's driving the cost of computing down in the whole business world. And because of that phenomena, we've formed a little company that we called Acorns. It's a micro-investing app. And, just like 20 years ago, we used to communicate by writing letters to each other. That's kind of an older way of doing it. Now we just send electrons to each other, and we don't think anything of it. It's just a natural way to communicate. And of course, we can communicate with many more people. And so it is in business that we can communicate with many more people. And so some of the most successful businesses now are using, electrons basically to get things done. And so what we did at Acorns was we basically wanted to make it easy for people to invest and get started investing early. The average age for investing had been about 34, 35 when you opened your first account before we started Acorns. And we've been able to drive that down to about 24, so about an extra 10 years of compounding for young people. And we think that's good. And so here's just a quick little commercial for Acorns. They pay for my time.
Like acorns grow into mighty oaks, small amounts invested can grow your wealth. Did you know you could change your life from all these small amounts? Acorns, the micro investing that takes your spare change and grows it over time. Instead of forgetting and let it all just work in the background of life. Anyone can grow that wealth, get the app. So grow your wealth, get the app. Invest in yourself, get the app. Invest in yourself, tell your friends. Acorns, grow your oak. Acorns, grow your oak.
So it's doing well. We're using a very ancient principle, that little tiny things can become big things. You don't have to start big. And so we use this acorns to oaks metaphor. It seems to resonate very well with young people nowadays, especially when it's wrapped in an app. And as mentioned, we've been able to attract 5 million customers or so, and it's doing well. So back to history, but let's start with future history. You all remember the show Star Trek with Captain Kirk and Spock, et cetera. One of the early long episodes talked about there being a Federation ship that was lost on another planet. And so Kirk and Spock and the gang were sent to go find that ship and see if there were any survivors or if it had crashed, what happened to it. And they got to this other planet, and bad news was indeed the ship had crashed. But the good news was there was an advanced alien life on that planet. They actually weren't the aliens because it was their planet. We were the aliens. But anyway, they were really smart. And so they were able to take this one little girl that survived and sort of stitch her back up and put her back together. But the bad news was they'd never seen a human before. So when they put her together, she ended up looking kind of alien. And that is what is happening right now when we try to piece together ancient history. We're making something grotesque out of it because we have this little bit of a mindset that anything that came before us must be more primitive. And it's because since about the 1800s, this notion of evolution, which I believe in on a very long term, has been sort of made very rigid, that, you know, things should always be evolving, and therefore there's not much to learn from our ancient ancestors. But in fact, we're learning more every day. And this is Corral, Peru, a complex in South America. When it was first discovered, maybe 30, 40 years ago or so, there's 7 pyramids here. They thought that it was built by the Incas about 500 years ago, because obviously there couldn't have been anybody very advanced in South America, because, you know, it really wasn't populated by smart people until Columbus came over here. But in fact, they did some digs here, and they found out that these temples had been built with baskets of stones. They didn't have the big blocks of stone like they have in Egypt. And they would set the baskets in place full of little stones, and the baskets were made out of an organic material which could be carbon dated, and it was just sealed in place. And they took this fiber to the University of Chicago and found out that this site is 4,700 years old, not 500 years old. And so it turns out the pyramids in the west here are contemporaneous with the pyramids in the east, Egypt. So that's a fascinating bit of history. Also, when you find these cultures that date to roughly 3000 BC or earlier, you don't find a lot of weapons around them. They found, you know, beautiful fabrics, beads, I think over 70 different types of seafood. You know, that's more than they serve at the best New York seafood restaurants. And materials that indicated that this complex had been trading at quite a wide distance with other civilizations. So it was quite an advanced civilization that we know nothing about, but we're just beginning to learn. And they're all over the world. And so I think we can sort of reshape our history if we study some of these. One of the most fascinating sites being uncovered right now is Göbekli Tepe in southeast Turkey. This is a site that was completely buried until about 20 years ago, and then a farmer kept tilling his fields there, and the plow kept running into some stones, and one day he says, "That's it, I'm digging this up." And of course, he was hitting the top of one of these pillars, and it turns out it's a Stonehenge-type site, except much, much, much larger. And for some reason, over 9,000 years ago, it was purposely buried. And this is important because had it not been buried, all these very fine bas-reliefs on the outside of the stones would have been completely lost. And what we've learned from these reliefs, they know it was buried on purpose, by the way some of the stones were stacked around the pillars, and also geologists have looked at it, and it wasn't just dust that had blown in over the years, which would make sort of strata. It was more jumbled, and so it was clearly purposely buried. And then these bas-reliefs are interesting in that all of them represent some sort of constellation. So the names of these animals are constellations that are in the sky now that were named in ancient times. And when I was growing up, they taught us that the zodiac, the 12 signs of the constellations, or the 12 constellations that roughly correspond within a few degrees of the equator around the Earth. And modern astronomers use these as a simple coordinate system. So you can say, Jupiter's in Taurus. But they thought it was about 2,000 years old, dated to the Babylonians. And indeed, what they found here was there's a bull, you can see at the top of that one. So a Taurus-type figure. There's a lion, like Leo the lion. At the bottom corner here, you can see a scorpion, so like Scorpius. And it turns out that the zodiac is not just 2,000 years old, it's probably at least 12,000 years old. And so they were studying the royal science, astronomy, long before we have been taught in our current textbooks. And there's a bunch of sites here. They've only uncovered a few of these, but the pillars are not used for supporting a roof because of the positions they're put in. They actually seem to have symbols of stars on them and then point off towards different constellations. So it has some stellar purpose. Still don't know exactly what it is. And this isn't a primitive type of building. You know, a primitive building might be round, it might be square, it might be rectangle, but it tends to be simpler shapes. And these shapes, I don't even know how to describe them, but they seem to be perfect for viewing the stars. Anyway, we expect to learn a lot there over the next 20 years. Another interesting piece about history is, you know, when were the Americas discovered and what was happening over here? And I remember when I was a boy in school, my history teacher said that Columbus discovered America in 1492. Before that, there wasn't much going on. And I raised my hand and said, well, they had boats before 1492, didn't they? You know, why didn't the Europeans get here before then? And he said, oh, the boats just weren't big enough. I said, oh, that's logical. And a few years passed, and they made this discovery outside the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau, and they dug up 9 different ships there. And these Columbus's ships were about 70 feet in length, 70 to 72 feet, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. The ships that they found buried on the Giza Plateau are 140 feet. So they're twice the length of Columbus's ships, plus they're 5,000 years old versus 500 years old. And you might say, well, that doesn't look very seaworthy. Maybe they could build a long one, but could they, you know, put higher rails on it? Of course they could. They built the pyramid right next to it. So it's, you know, we have these notions of history that are just proving to be incorrect the more we study, and so we're rewriting history on the fly. Another great discovery that's been in the news on PBS is the Antikythera device. It was found off the Isle of Antikythera in the Aegean Sea. It was actually found in the early 1900s, this thing over on the right, and they thought, oh, that's a ship anchor. And they were able to date it very precisely because it was embedded with shells and coins and amphora from the period of roughly 200 BC to about 1 AD or so. And so it sat there in the Athens Museum until, so the story goes, one night a janitor knocked it over and it splayed out these gears inside. And this is a problem for historians. They're not supposed to have gears. We weren't supposed to invent geared devices until the great clockmaking era of 12, 13, 1400 AD in Europe. And so they've slowly recreated this, and they found that these gear ratios represent the planet's orbits. And so it was some kind of a computer to determine the orbits of the planets long before Ptolemy or Copernicus actually discovered what those orbits were. So fascinating device. Another great story is Volta invented the battery in the year 1700 or so. And it was a primitive battery. It produced about 2 watts of energy. And so that's where we thought batteries were invented until they were digging in Baghdad and found these crude type of batteries. And some of the scientists fixed them up and put an acidic juice in it, like a grapefruit or vinegar or something like that. And they were able to get 4 watts of energy out of them. And so we still don't know what they were used for, but electricity and batteries were discovered long before we ever thought. And so this goes on and on and on. Dentistry, I don't have time to get into that one, but they took this tooth from these skulls found in Pakistan to a dentist, and a modern dentist, and they didn't tell him where it came from, and said, tell us about this. And the dentist said, well, that's pretty good work there. You can see they use different types of drills to drill out the cavities, and they were able to get very close to the enamel without chipping it off. This is good work. Who did this? And of course, the anthropologists are kind of at a loss to explain it, you know, because anything older than us must be more primitive. Here in the West, a couple hundred years ago, if you had a bad tooth, they'd take you to the barber shop, give you some whiskey and pull it out. So the anthropologists assume they must have used a stick with a flint end and spun it really fast, and a dirty stick because it's primitive. But in reality, you just can't do that in a rear molar. So no one really knows quite how these things were done. And some of the inventions we still don't know how to recreate today. This is this black soil that's being found now all over South America. And it's man-made, and we know it's man-made because in the soil you find a lot of pottery shards. And some of the residue was organic material in the pottery shards, and they were able to date that to about 9,000 years ago or so. And the modern Indians in the Amazon get very excited when they find this black soil. They call it Terra Preta do Indio, because it'll grow a cash crop like papayas in about half the time that the normal jungle soil would, which is rather poor in nutrients. And so it's been studied by Cornell. They find that it's a lot like yogurt, you know. You have 5 billion microorganisms per cubic centimeter. And Cornell's now studied it for about 20 years and still does not know how to recreate it. So it's a fascinating thing, and we're still learning. And I think very ancient cultures, long before the Dark Ages, lived very much in tune with nature, and they're making a lot of discoveries lately that even their farming methods were sort of intermingled with the jungle, that they knew they needed some properties from nature, versus today, you know, this will be a cornfield and they'll just plow everything for 2 miles and plant corn. Many other discoveries were made in ancient times and lost, just such as democracy in ancient Greece, the heliocentric system. Copernicus, they found 5 books in his possession when he passed away. 3 of those were ancient Greek. And so he was a really smart guy, but he wasn't that smart because he was digging up knowledge that had been lost for over 1,000 years and saying this makes more sense than the current system, as we were just starting to come out of the Dark Ages there. In ancient Mesopotamia, they still have many underground sewer systems that they have found and used today. In the Indus Valley, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, magnificent cities with uniform building materials. And so you have to ask, you know, why didn't this evolve into an industrial age or whatever it is at that time? And this is where we get back to the cycle of history again. We were just in the wrong part of the cycle. You know, we were coming down towards the Dark Ages rather than evolving up. So even though you had some great inventions, they didn't stick. So a quick hypothesis for this great year view of history comes from Sri Yukteswar. He wrote a little book in the 1800s, late 1800s, and it's about religion, really. It's about the similarities between Christianity and the Sanatana Dharma, the religion they practice in the Indus Valley there by the Hindus. And he said, before I can really explain how all religion is the same, First, I have to tell you why you really won't understand that right now. And he goes into this lost knowledge of the cycles. And he basically says that just as the Earth spins on its axis, and that gives you a cycle of day and night, and it completely changes our consciousness from, subconscious sleeping state where we were a few hours ago to conscious right now, and it does that every day. And just as the year, as the seasons are caused by the Earth moving around the sun, so does our whole solar system go around another star, and that causes the same type of cycle, but with a very long period. It's roughly 12,000 years up, 12,000 years down. And so that's one person talking about it, but there are others that have independently looked at history and found the same thing. And this is Giorgio de Santayana and Hertha von Deschen. Giorgio was taught at Harvard. He was a former professor of the history of science at MIT, just a brilliant scientist. And he got together with Hertha, who is a brilliant anthropologist, and they were trying to figure out the origin of science. Where did science come from? And so they thought it had something to do with the stars, the royal science. And so they studied all these myths about the stars. And Hertha, if you read the book, was just going crazy. And she said she was just about to tear her hair out after 10 years of reading myths and realized she didn't understand a single sentence. And then she kind of was looking at a map and realized that a lot of these ancient structures were on the equator or on the Tropic of Capricorn or Cancer and had something to do with astronomy. And once she discovered the astronomy key, she could make sense of a lot of the myths. That's Taurus is fighting Jupiter in the underworld. Jupiter happens to be passing through the sign of Taurus as below the horizon. And everything started to make a lot of sense. And you could even time when that story was written based on when that happened in history. Another great scientist who realized the ancients practiced and knew about this cycle is Stefan Moll. He's considered the foremost Assyrianologist in the world, really the guy that helped interpret ancient Akkadian, a language that people don't even write or speak anymore. And he can read these cuneiform texts. I can't even find a letter in there. But he would find just one symbol, and one of the first ones he found was the word eyelash. And then from that, he found more and more and more and more and realized that some of these texts are talking about archaeology. So 5,000 years ago, because this comes from about 3000 BC, they know how to make paper. They give you the formula for making papyrus in the clay text, but for some reason they want to put it in this indelible substance and save it for some reason. And but he finds they're practicing archaeology for a period roughly 3,000 years prior to when they existed. And when they find an ancient structure, they try to resurrect it and change it by no more than an eyelash. And because they revered the past, they knew that these ancient structures had a purpose, and they wanted to try to hang on to these Golden Age influences. In China, they talked about this time of a higher age. Confucius repeatedly describes that he's not particularly gifted, but someone who loves the ancients. He studies the ancient cultures, and he's learning the ways handed down by the ancients. And he looked back at the Zhou dynasty as a lost golden age, although the true golden age was even farther back than that. But this was a very common way of looking at history prior to modern times. And so to break down this cycle, it's kind of like your watch or the way we tell time in the day. It's a little microcosm of it. So it's supposedly caused by our whole solar system going around another star. And as you get closer to a certain point in space, you have a high age of enlightenment. As you get farther away from the sweet influence of this point in space, you have a darker age. So it's 12,000 years up, sort of increasing light, and then 12,000 years down. And so the last peak would have been about 11,500 BC, a time of myth. And then, of course, all the great civilizations are falling as we're heading towards the low point, which is about 500 AD. So 12,000 years up, 12,000 years down. And, you know, in this last period before everything falls apart, of course, Egypt has fallen apart, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, the great Indus Valley, and even Greece has fallen, Rome has fallen by 500 AD. You know, they're shuttering Plato's Academy, and you have this period of dark ages. And, you know, we think we have problems in the world nowadays. Imagine living when, you know, plagues would ravage the earth and half the people would die, or if there's a fire, you know, pretty much the whole city burns down. Or if there's an injustice, you know, you're taken to a torture chamber or something like that, you know, like during the Inquisition. It just really wasn't very nice. And if you look back just 600 years ago, not only every country is at war with one another, but every county and every duchy is at war with one another. And so, yes, we have some problems today, but it's a lot better than it was, you know, just 500 or 600 years ago. So, looking at the possible causes of this cycle, it seems that modern astronomers are starting to figure out that indeed our solar system is moving and something big is affecting it. And this is important because if they find out that there is another physical cycle going on, they'll hopefully relate that to history. And when you have a cause, it's easier to understand an effect. So let me play just a very short clip from Caltech. And the first person speaking is Mike Brown, one of the most famous astronomers in the world right now. He wrote a book, How I Killed Pluto and Why It Had It Coming. And he took us from 9 planets back to 8 planets. And it's because he discovered all these dwarf planets.
When we looked at the outer solar system, we realized that while most of the very distant objects, these objects beyond Neptune, beyond Pluto, most of these objects, they all go around the sun and they're all sort of pointing off in all different directions. But the most distant objects all swing out in one direction in a very strange way that shouldn't happen. And we realized that the only way we could get them to all swing in one direction is if there is a massive planet also very distant in the solar system, keeping them in place while they all go around the sun.
So you see they all go around the sun, and their close point, their perihelion, is all bunched around the same place. And it's just too much of a coincidence. Plus, they're all elongated orbits, and they go towards the southwest. And so all these scientists are looking in the direction of Sirius Orion for this big planet. And I might add, when they first discovered perturbations in Uranus, they realized that there must be another planet out there, and they discovered Neptune with 1800s technology within 48 hours. And then when they watched Neptune for a while, they realized, oh, there's a little perturbation there. There must be something that's affecting Neptune. And they found Pluto in 1931 within 24 hours. So they're finding them pretty quick, even with old technologies. Today, they're looking for this 9th planet because it's affecting our entire solar system. Not just the dwarf planets are all elongated and stretched to the south, but even all the major planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. There's a lot of mass there. They're all tilted about 6 degrees below the equator of the sun. So something big is tugging and pulling on our solar system, and our solar system is in motion. And here's Mike Brown's partner has got a couple words to add just to fill the picture in a little bit.
And we started looking at this and thinking, this is this must be either a coincidence or it's caused by something else. It can't be caused by a planet because that's crazy. There are no planets out there. I went from trying very hard to be skeptical that what we were talking about was true to suddenly thinking, oh, this actually might even be true.
So the object itself likely is more massive than the Earth, probably a little bit less massive than Neptune. It sits right in between that terrestrial to giant icy planet range. Its orbit, unlike the orbits of the known planets, is not nearly circular and planar. Instead, it is exceptionally wide, 20 times bigger than the orbit of Neptune. The orbital period of the Earth is, of course, 1 year. Right? The orbital period of Jupiter, the big player in our solar system, is about 10 years. The orbital period of this putative ninth planet is 20,000 years.
Aha, so we're getting really close to this 24,000-year period. So I need to cut to the chase here a little bit. So they've been looking for this planet for about 2 years now, with every top astronomer in the world pointing all the most expensive telescopes at this area in the sky where it should be, and they haven't found a thing. I think it's because it's a star, and we've just been able to prove Einstein's theories about gravitational waves. They were kind of considered, just a theory, but we built some instruments that can detect gravity waves. And so people now realize that stars can affect us from a farther distance than we thought. And so here, if you look at our solar system, there's the sun in the very middle. You have a few close stars like Alpha Centauri, Barnard's star, but Sirius is the big heavy in our local neighborhood. It's 3 solar masses, Sirius A and Sirius B, and Sirius B itself is a super dense star. All the atoms are packed together, so if you had a teaspoonful of it, it would weigh about 4,000 pounds. So we think that Sirius B is making this huge gravity well around Sirius A. And I've had some friends that have set up experiments in Canada, and they find that even when the B passes in between Earth and Sirius A, it actually affects the rotation of the Earth. It slows down a little bit right before that and speeds up a little bit right after that, like there's a gravitational resistance and then a breakthrough. Other modern scientists have noticed something strange going on with Sirius. Jed Buchwald, who's the head of the history of science at Caltech, has done historical studies, and he found out that all these great mathematicians and astronomers were arguing about Sirius and why it doesn't seem to be affected by precession when all other stars are. And it goes back really to the ancient Egyptians. They talked about Sirius. One of the star shafts in the Queen's chamber points to this star. How odd that it should point to Sirius in our lifetime. Or maybe it always points to Sirius because Sirius moves a little bit different than the other stars. And the oldest religion in Japan, the Shinto, actually called Sirius our second sun, and they align their temples to it to this day. Wow. The Egyptians, they seem to have a special relationship. They called Sirius Isis, and you see a lot of pictographs, motifs, hieroglyphics of Isis and Horus, which is a depiction of our Earth or sun in some sort of relationship together. And so here's Horus when he's young with Isis, and Isis seems to be suckling Horus, like, our solar system is somehow nourished by Sirius. Or even when Horus is older, Isis still seems to be manipulating Horus somehow. So, these aren't very well interpreted. We don't have a basis for understanding it, but I think when we understand astronomy a little bit better, we'll understand what these symbols mean. So somehow there's a connection, just as our consciousness changes every day from when we go from light to darkness, because our bodies are adapted to the electromagnetic of the spectrum of the sun. We think that there's something coming from space that also affects the entire Earth and all the planets in the solar system in a similar manner, but over a much longer period of time. And Hans Alfvén won the Nobel Prize for saying that, yeah, stars really do affect us, and they affect the sun, which also has an effect on us. And so there's a bunch of different theories we're looking at as analogies. One of these might be transcranial magnetic stimulation, which some of you probably know about. So it does appear we are affected by subtle energies. One of the oldest books in the Bible is the book of Job. They seem to be talking about this whole concept here in this statement. Some think that the solar system, although it might be in a gravitational relationship with Sirius, it's not Sirius that's having the effect on us. It drives us closer to and farther from another point in space, which some believe is the Pleiades. And here's Job is saying, "Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion?" And so it's a rhetorical question. Hey, man, can't we just stay in the summer of the great year, really forever, hang on to this golden age? He's saying, no, not anymore that you can break apart the stars in Orion's band. It's part of life. You have these natural cycles. And so part of the project I'm working on is teaching this cycle not only to older people, but to younger people too. And this is a page from the children's book, is How to Tell Time in the Great Year. And you can do this yourself. You just basically see where the sun is on the equinox, and you'll notice it moves about 1 degree every 72 years or so. And so if you use a great marker like a Stonehenge or something like that, that doesn't move, it's very easy to tell. Hesiod, the fabulous Greek historian, talked about this higher age and said the earth gave of itself freely. Dying was like just going to sleep. And they all thought he was a great historian, but we consider him today just a mythologist because we don't believe his stories. And he talked about people living much older in the higher ages. And if you look at just the last 100 years, the average lifespan's almost doubled here in the West, from the mid-40s to the mid-80s or so. And we can expect that to continue as we move into the current age. And the Greeks had very wise descriptions of each of these ages. So the age of man is, you just think you're a human thing and there's nothing else going on, and it's a pretty brutal time. The age of the hero that we've just come into with the Renaissance, the Bronze Age, you start to rediscover who you are. I do have greater possibilities. I can be a change agent for the world. And that's a lot of what's going on right now. And then the age of the demigods, according to Hollywood, that's when a god marries a human. But according to history, it's when a human's becoming a god. It's a little more important. And the age of the gods, the golden age, is almost impossible for us to understand. But a lot of people have talked about it, including this guy, He was referring to history, the Old Testament, when he said, isn't it written that ye are gods? These things that I do, you should do also, greater things. So keep that in mind, that history might be a little bit different than we were taught. And everything's getting a little more transparent. And if you want to use that for business, you can. We kind of just figure where the electron's going and formed a number of successful businesses based on this. Blast and ATM are our two latest companies. We use just ways to get micro income to people. And so that's a quick overview of the great year. Thank you for listening.